The signal went out on a cold Tuesday by Varan reckoning. No ceremony, no second thoughts. Counselor Dravik simply nodded at Administrator Salna, and Salna pressed a single key. That was all it took to start something neither of them would ever fully stop. The signal was a masterpiece of deception. It mimicked a Deathali civilian emergency broadcast, the kind of desperate broken transmission that the Galactic Oversight Assembly was legally required to investigate. It spoke of a geological collapse on the second Orin moon, toxic gas venting, thousands of lives at risk. It was entirely false. The Deathali were fine. They were, in fact, at that exact moment, holding a quiet harvest festival in the lowland fields of that very same moon. Children were running between the crop rows. Old people were singing. But no one would know that for a while. That was the point. The Varan Collective had done this before, not with this exact signal but with the same basic method. Find a weak species with land you want, manufacture a crisis, arrive as helpers, never leave. The Pelhari had lost 2 asteroid mining stations this way. The Urish Compact had lost a whole trade corridor. Both times the Galactic Oversight Assembly had investigated and found the evidence inconclusive. The Varan were very careful about inconclusive. Dravik was already planning the next step, the slow establishment of a Varan relief station on the Orin moon, which would quietly become a military outpost, which would quietly become a territorial claim, when Salna turned around in her chair with a strange look on her face. She said the signal had gone out through relay node Gamma 7. Dravik said that was fine. Salna said that Gamma 7 sat adjacent to a new human transit corridor. There was a pause. Dravik asked how new. Salna checked her screen. The corridor had been registered 8 months ago. Their star maps were 14 months old. Dravik sat down. Far out in Sector 7 Gamma, a human deep-range freighter called the RSV Carrion Comfort was hauling a load of industrial drilling equipment through the outer lanes when the signal arrived. It came through on the standard emergency frequency, clear and clean. The ship's automatic systems flagged it immediately and woke the duty officer. The duty officer was a navigator named Wohl. He was 26 years old, had been in space since he was 19, and had a habit of reading political history in his off hours. He looked at the signal. He looked at the coordinates. He looked at the political maps he kept bookmarked on his personal screen. Then he went and knocked on the door of the cargo hold where the captain was doing an inventory check. The captain's name was Rudo. He was a compact, patient man who had worked the outer lanes for 11 years. He did not get surprised easily. He listened to Wohl explain the signal, looked at the coordinates himself, and asked one question: how far off their route was it? Wohl said roughly 9 hours at current speed. Rudo closed the inventory log. He pulled up the navigation panel and began entering the new heading. He did not call command. He did not consult the cargo company. A distress signal was a distress signal, and 9 hours was 9 hours. He told Wohl to send a standard acknowledgement on the emergency channel. They were responding, ETA 9 hours, and went back to his inventory. Wohl sent the acknowledgement. He also, quietly, pulled up everything the human database had on the Orin cluster. He read it during his next 2 hours on duty. By the end of it, he had a feeling this was going to be more interesting than a geological collapse. On the Varan command ship, an alert went off. Someone had answered the distress signal. Salna checked the registry code. The response had come in at a speed that meant the vessel was already close, far closer than any Galactic Oversight Assembly patrol ship could be. Salna ran the registry code through the database 3 times because the first 2 results seemed impossible. She told Dravik. Dravik opened the database entry on humans. He read the first paragraph. He read the part about their home planet, high gravity, high radiation, a biosphere that seemed specifically designed to kill things. He read the part about their immune systems, which could apparently handle bacteria that would liquefy most known species. He read the note that said humans had survived 3 separate near-extinction events and responded each time by expanding more aggressively. He read the line about their average bite force. He closed the file. He stood at the window for a while, looking at the stars. Then he said, quietly, that they needed to get their patrol ships moving, now, faster than planned, immediately. Because whatever happened next, they could not afford to let a human crew be the first ones on site at an emergency that did not exist. But even as he said it, he already knew. The acknowledgement had been sent 9 hours ago. Whoever Rudo was, he was already on his way. The RSV Carrion Comfort came out of transit at the edge of the Orin cluster at a time when the Varan patrol ships were still 4 hours away. That 4-hour gap would later be described by Galactic Oversight Assembly historians as the most consequential gap in modern interstellar diplomacy. At the time, it was just a Tuesday. Rudo brought the ship in slowly, running full passive scans. The Orin cluster was beautiful in a quiet way, 2 green-gray moons hanging in orbit around a pale gas giant, with a wide asteroid field catching the distant starlight like scattered glass. There was no smoke, no debris, no signs of geological damage on either moon. The second moon, where the emergency signal had claimed a collapse was happening, looked entirely peaceful. Rudo watched the scan data come in. He was not a man who showed a lot on his face. His chief engineer, Petra, came up from the lower deck and stood next to him at the display and looked at the same data. Petra was tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that had been repairing machinery in hard vacuum since she was an apprentice. She looked at the green readings on the scan display, stable atmosphere, normal seismic activity, no signs of any emergency, and said one word. She said, "Huh." Rudo opened the communication channel to the second moon. The response came quickly. The Deathali did not keep people waiting. A small face appeared on screen. Large eyes, soft features, a pale green complexion. The Deathali administrator on duty looked at Rudo with the polite, slightly anxious expression of someone who had never had a human call them before. Rudo introduced himself and his ship. He asked about the emergency. The administrator said there was no emergency. Rudo asked again, more specifically. He named the coordinates from the distress signal. He described the reported geological collapse. The administrator called over 2 other Deathali to look at the screen. They talked among themselves in quick, soft sounds. Then the first one turned back and said, very carefully, that there had been no such event. The second moon was fine. The harvest festival was still ongoing. Would the humans like to attend? Rudo thanked them and ended the call. He stood for a moment, then he said, "Petra, where did that signal actually come from?" Petra was already working on it. She had a talent for triangulation that went beyond what the standard ship systems could do. She had spent years customizing the Carrion Comfort sensor suite because, as she often explained, factory settings were for people who liked being surprised. She ran the signal backward through 3 relay nodes, compensating for drift and atmospheric scatter, and printed the result on a physical strip of paper because she liked to hand things to people. She handed it to Rudo. He looked at it. The origin point was deep space. The direction was Varan collective territory. Wohl, who had been listening from his navigation station, said, "I was going to mention, I read a lot about the Orin cluster on the way here. The Varan have been trying to establish a foothold here for about 30 years. Rudo looked at him. "You knew?" Wohl said, "I suspected. I didn't want to say it out loud in case I was wrong." Rudo looked at the paper again. He was quiet for a while. Outside the ship, the Orin moons turned slowly. The Deathali Harvest Festival was probably still going on down there. Children were probably still running between the crop rows. The ship's medic, Anya, came up from the medical bay and announced that she had cross-referenced the atmospheric data from the second moon, and it was not only safe but had a very pleasant oxygen-nitrogen mix. And if no one needed her for an emergency, she paused pointedly. She would like to request that they land so she could pick up some soil samples. She had a project. Nobody said no. Rudo filed a standard landing request with the Deathali administrator, who agreed with what seemed like genuine excitement. The Carrion Comfort set down in a cleared field near the settlement. The landing struts sank slightly into soft, dark soil. When the ramp came down, the air came in, and it smelled like turned earth and something sweet that nobody could name. The Deathali administrator and 3 others were waiting at the bottom of the ramp, and one of them was holding a woven basket of fruit. Rudo walked down first. He looked at the fruit. He looked at the Deathali. He said, "Thank you, we were not expecting this." The administrator said that strangers who arrived in confusion were always offered food. It was a very old custom. Then the administrator asked, gently, why the humans had come. Rudo said, "Someone sent a fake emergency signal from your location. We're trying to figure out who and why." The elder standing behind the administrator, a figure the others addressed as Blessed Amu, very old, very still, said, "We can tell you the why. The Varin have wanted these moons for 30 years. They have tried many things. This is simply the latest." Rudo nodded slowly. He took a piece of the fruit. He ate it. It tasted like sweet mushrooms and something faintly like orange peel. He said, "All right, tell us everything." And the Deathali, who had been waiting 30 years for someone to ask, did exactly that. Blessed Amu had a memory that went back 60 Deathali years, which was roughly equivalent to 90 standard galactic ones. Amu remembered the first Varin survey team. They had arrived with charts and smiles and a long list of questions about mineral rights. They had left when the Deathali politely said the moons were not for survey. Then, some years later, a Varin trade mission arrived and began building a small way station on the outer asteroid edge of the cluster. Just for commerce, they said. Just for mutual benefit. The Deathali had asked the Galactic Oversight Assembly for advice. The assembly sent a letter. The letter said to negotiate in good faith. The way station quietly doubled in size. That pattern had repeated itself 5 more times in 60 years. Always a different shape. Always the same direction. Rudo listened to all of it sitting, cross-legged on the ground outside the settlement, while Petra inspected the structural quality of the landing field's soil, with the focused attention of someone who could never quite stop being an engineer. Wohl was taking notes on his tablet. Anya had already collected her soil samples, and was now sitting with 2 young Deathali who were showing her local plants, communicating mostly through gestures and enthusiastic pointing. When Amu finished, Rudo said, "They never succeeded." Amu said, "They always stopped just short. The Galactic Oversight Assembly would begin to notice. The Varin would pause. Then they would try something new." Wohl looked up from his tablet. "The pattern is documented. I found references to 6 separate assembly inquiries. All of them ended inconclusive." Rudo asked, "What made this time different from the previous attempts?" Wohl said, "The signal. The others were all economic or administrative maneuvers. This is the first time they've used a fake emergency broadcast. It's a legal escalation. If they'd arrived first as rescuers, they'd have grounds to file a temporary protection claim on the moon." Amu said quietly, "And temporary never ends." A new voice came through the ship's open comm. One of the crew still aboard, a mechanic named Brick, who had the specific gift of noticing things at bad times, reported that 2 Varin patrol ships had just dropped out of transit at the edge of the cluster. Rudo stood up. He thanked Amu. He walked back up the ramp at a pace that was not quite a hurry but was not casual either. The Varin ships had positioned themselves in a high orbit that covered both the Carrion Comfort's position and the main Deathali settlement. It was a classic intimidation posture, visible, capable, saying nothing. The kind of presence designed to make a smaller vessel feel watched. Rudo had been in enough crowded ports and difficult docking situations to recognize the language of implicit threat. A channel opened. The face that appeared was broad, smooth, and professionally warm. The Varan counselor introduced himself as Dravik. He said he was relieved to see that another ship had responded to the emergency signal. He said it showed the beauty of interstellar cooperation. He said the signal had, regrettably, been part of an internal Varan emergency response coordination drill, a multi-species readiness exercise, and he thanked the humans warmly for their impressive response time. He implied they should feel honored. He implied they should go home. Rudo listened to all of this without changing his expression. When Dravik finished, Rudo said, "Thank you, we're going to stay a bit longer." Dravik's warmth did not flicker. He said he understood, but the situation was resolved, and he would hate for the humans to waste more of their valuable time. Rudo said, "It's our time." The channel closed. Petra, who had come back aboard, looked at the patrol ship positions on the sensor display. She noted their weapons' signatures active, not charged but available. She noted their formation tight enough to be a statement, loose enough to claim it wasn't. She said, "They want us to feel small." Rudo said, "I know." Petra thought for a moment, then she said, "I need to do hull maintenance on the port side, scheduled anyway." Rudo said, "Go ahead." Petra went outside in a pressure suit with a standard inspection kit and spent 40 minutes doing entirely routine hull checks on the side of the ship, facing the Varan patrol vessels. Every time one of them completed an orbit and came around into visible range, she waved. She waved cheerfully. She waved the way a person waves at a slow-moving vehicle in a quiet neighborhood. Wohl logged every sensor reading, every communication, every position change of the Varan ships with full timestamps, and uploaded the log to the public interstellar record under the standard Navigational Transparency Protocol, a regulation that required vessels in contested zones to maintain open position records. It was a real regulation. It was rarely used this aggressively. Brick, who had nothing technical to do, set up a folding chair in the observation bay and watched the patrol ship's orbit. He had brought a bag of dried fruit from the Deathali settlement and ate it slowly. On the Varan patrol ship, the captain filed a report to Dravik. The report said, "The humans appear unbothered." Dravik sent back a one-line reply asking them to be more visible. The patrol captain looked at the report for a long time, trying to figure out what more visible meant when you were already in low orbit directly above someone's ship. He had no good answer. He sent back a confirmation and did not sleep well that night. The idea started with Wohl and a cup of cold grain tea he had forgotten about. He was reading through Varan collective legal documents, specifically the ones pertaining to territorial protection claims following emergency response operations, and he noticed something. The legal framework that would allow the Varan to file a temporary protection claim on the Oran moon required that their ships arrive at the site of the emergency before any galactic oversight assembly observer. It did not say anything about what happened if another vessel was already there, actively on record, actively transmitting, actively documenting the absence of any emergency. He picked up his cold tea, he stared at it, he put it down. He went to find Rudo. Rudo was in the small galley at the back of the ship, eating a meal that Anya had put together using some of the Deathali vegetables she had traded for that afternoon. The Deathali had been delighted to trade. They had asked for human spices in return, which Anya had provided from the ship's stores. There was now, somewhere in the Deathali settlement below, an elder who was discovering what black pepper tasted like for the first time. Wohl sat down and explained what he had found. Rudo listened. He asked 2 questions. Wohl answered both. Rudo said, "So as long as we're here broadcasting our position, they can't file the claim." Wohl said, "That's what the regulation says. We're a registered vessel in the response zone. We arrived because of the signal. We're part of the incident record now. If they want to claim the claim is valid, they have to explain what we're doing here, and that means explaining the signal, and explaining the signal means explaining why it was fake." Rudo finished his food. He said, Then we stay. Wohl said he had also, while reading the documents, drafted a formal notification to the Galactic Oversight Assembly. It was a standard navigational report, a vessel in a contested zone, noting the presence of 2 Varan patrol ships, noting the origin data of the distress signal, noting the absence of any actual emergency. All factual, all documented, all technically required by the same transparency regulation he had already been using. He asked if Rudo wanted to send it. Rudo said, "Send it." Wohl sent it. On the Varan patrol ship, a communication came in from the patrol captain's superior. It was not polite. It said the humans were becoming a problem. It said the patrol captain needed to make it clear to the Carrion Comfort crew that vessels operating outside registered transit corridors face certain complications: insurance reviews, cargo inspections, route certification delays. The language was careful. It was not a threat. It was a description of complications. The patrol captain composed the message and sent it to the Carrion Comfort with deep personal reluctance. On the Carrion Comfort, Rudo read the message. He read it twice. He did not say anything dramatic. He forwarded it, with full headers and transmission metadata, directly to the Galactic Oversight Assembly's public submission portal. He wrote a 3-line cover note: "Received this message from Varan Patrol Command, attaching for the record, coordinates and timestamps included." Then he sent it. 4 minutes later, a second message came from the patrol captain. This one was much shorter. It said, "Please disregard the previous message. It was sent in error." Rudo forwarded that one too. Below on the Deathali moon, something else was happening. Blessed Amu had called a moon council session, the first formal council in 11 years. The elders sat in a circle in the old stone hall at the center of the settlement, and Amu spoke for a long time. Amu said that for 30 years they had feared that speaking too loudly would make the Varan move faster. They had been quiet. They had been careful. They had written polite letters to the Galactic Oversight Assembly and received polite non-answers. But now there was a human ship sitting in their field, and the humans were not quiet at all. The humans were logging everything, sending it everywhere, and apparently waving at the Varan patrol ships. Amu said, if there was ever a time to speak, it was when someone else was already making noise. The council voted unanimously to file a formal complaint with the Galactic Oversight Assembly. Not a letter, a formal complaint with full documentation, 30 years of Varan encroachment attempts, survey missions, way station expansions, and what they now knew about the distress signal. The Deathali legal representative, a younger woman named Felu who had studied assembly law and never had a reason to use it, stayed up through the night preparing the document. On the Varan command ship, Dravik received a report of the Deathali complaint. He received a report that the humans had forwarded both patrol ship communications to the assembly portal. He received a report that the Carrion Comfort's position logs had been entered into the public interstellar record and were now visible to any registered assembly member state. He sat alone in his office for a while. His assistant asked if he wanted to compose a response. Dravik said not yet. He needed to think. Everything was still manageable. The assembly moved slowly. Investigations took time. Inconclusive was still possible if they were careful. He just needed the humans to leave. He stared at the sensor display showing the Carrion Comfort, sitting patient and solid in the landing field below, lights blinking in the dark. The humans showed no indication of leaving. Subcommander Ayerth had a habit of reading things no one asked her to read. She had been the Varan military liaison on this operation from the beginning. Her job was to coordinate patrol ship movements and act as a buffer between Dravik's political decisions and the realities of space operations. She was good at her job. She was also, privately, very good at reading between lines, a skill that had kept her career clean and her conscience complicated for 20 years. On the third day of the standoff, when Dravik was in closed meetings with his legal team, and the patrol captains were spending most of their time trying to figure out how to look threatening without doing anything that would appear in a public log. Irth sat alone in the communications room and read the Human Historical Archive. Not the summary, the full archive going back to first contact. She read about their wars, not the numbers. Most species had numbers. She read about the texture of them, the way humans did not stop, the way a human force that was outnumbered and outgunned would frequently find a third option nobody had thought of, usually because the third option involved doing something uncomfortable that other species had already ruled out. She read about the persistence. She read about what happened when you cornered them. She also read something else, something quieter. She read about a dozen cases, obscure, old, not often discussed, where humans had simply sat down next to an injustice and refused to move until someone with authority showed up. Not fighting, not threatening, just present, just watching, just making it real. She thought about what had happened to the Pelhari and the Urish Compact, the species the Varan had successfully maneuvered before. In both cases, there had been no witnesses. The assembly had found nothing definitive, inconclusive. She thought about the carrion comfort sitting on that moon with its transponder broadcasting, its logs in the public record, its crew forwarding every suspicious communication to the assembly in real time. There would be no inconclusive this time. She opened a private channel and began to write. It took her 4 hours. She wrote everything: the planning meetings, Dravik's orders, the deliberate construction of the false signal, the intent behind the patrol ship deployment, the message that had been sent to the human crew, which she had considered at the time to be a significant mistake. She wrote it plainly and clearly because she was not a person who used complicated language when simple language was accurate. She submitted it to the Galactic Oversight Assembly whistleblower portal, encrypted and legally protected. She used her real name. She saw no point in hiding. Then she went to the galley, made herself something hot, and waited. What happened 37 hours later was 3 Galactic Oversight Assembly observer ships dropping out of transit at the edge of the Orin cluster. They were crewed by Pelhari, Urish, and 1 Deathali representative who had traveled from the Assembly's outer station specifically for this case. The senior observer was a Pelhari named Commissioner Yaveth, who had been building cases against Varan collective expansionism for 11 years and had never had one stick. She had Irth's testimony before she even completed her transit deceleration. Yaveth's first communication was not to Dravik. It was to the RSV Carrion Comfort. She introduced herself and formally requested the vessel's complete sensor logs from the moment of distress signal reception to the present. She also requested, separately, the crew's personal account of events. Rudo replied within 6 minutes. He sent the logs, all of them. Every scan, every triangulation result, every communication, every forwarded message, every timestamp, the wave sensor data from when Petra had waved at the patrol ships, which was technically part of the hull maintenance log, but Rudo included it anyway because it was accurate and the timestamp was useful. He also wrote a short summary of events in his own words. It was less than a page. It said, "Received distress signal, responded, found no emergency, found signal was fake, found the signal came from Varan territory, spoke to the Deathali, stayed to make sure it was in the record." Yaveth read the summary. She read it a second time. She said to her aide, "He just stayed." Her aide said, "Yes, Commissioner." She said he had no orders, no political mandate. He just stayed because he thought someone should be watching. Her aide did not have an answer for that. Dravik requested an urgent meeting with Yaveth. Yaveth granted him 1 hour. He arrived with lawyers, with precedent documents, with a carefully constructed alternative narrative in which everything was a misunderstanding, and the Varan were, in fact, the party most deserving of sympathy. He was good. He had been doing this for a long time. Yaveth let him finish. Then she said she would like to speak to the human crew. Dravik said that seemed unnecessary. Yaveth looked at him with the expression of someone who had heard many things that were unnecessary and had learned to ignore them. She repeated her request. Dravik said he would prefer the inquiry focus on documented materials. Yaveth said the crew of the Carrion Comfort were documented materials. They were witnesses. They had documentation, and she intended to hear it. Dravik left the meeting. He went back to his ship. He sat in his chair and looked at the stars for a long time, and for the first time in the whole operation, he could not find the next move. In the communications room, Irth finished her hot drink and started packing her personal belongings into a small case. She did not need to rush, but she thought it was probably better to be ready. Rudo sat in front of Commissioner Yaveth and her panel and did not feel nervous. He felt the way he felt during difficult docking operations, focused, slightly tired, aware that the most useful thing he could do was be accurate. Yaveth asked him to describe what happened. He described the signal, the course change, Petra's triangulation and what it showed, Dravik's explanation which he had not believed and why, what blessed Amu had told him, the decision to stay. Yaveth asked, "Why did you stay?" Rudo said, "Because if we left and nothing was on record, it would be like it never happened, and it did happen." The Urish observer wrote something down. The Deathali representative closed their eyes. Yaveth said, "You had no orders to remain, no political interest, no territorial stake." Rudo said, "We were delivering drilling equipment." There was a quiet in the room. Petra's testimony was almost entirely technical. The triangulation method, relay node calculations, the signal origin margin of error, which she described as very low. She also mentioned, in a flat tone, that during the Varan patrol ship's close-range sensor passes, she had incidentally recorded several details about their propulsion architecture. She offered to delete those readings. Yaveth said that would not be necessary. Wohl's testimony covered the political history, 6 previous assembly inquiries, the pattern of Varan encroachment, the legal framework the fake signal was built to exploit. He had organized it with dates and case numbers and brought printed copies for the panel. Yaveth had seen most of it before, in pieces. She had never seen it assembled this cleanly. She asked who had prepared it. Wohl said he had. On the way here, he said he read a lot on long routes. The deliberations took 9 days. Dravik's legal team filed 4 challenge documents, each longer than the last, containing increasingly complicated arguments about emergency response definitions and assembly jurisdiction. The panel read all of them. Yaveth reviewed Irth's whistleblower testimony against the Carrion Comfort's sensor logs and found they matched at every point. On the 9th day, the ruling came. The Varan Collective was formally censured for deliberate false emergency broadcasting under Assembly Treaty Code 7. The Orin cluster moons were recognized as Deathali sovereign territory and granted assembly protection status. Any future Varan approach would require assembly notification and consent. Dravik was removed from his position pending an ethics review. His legal team issued a 40-page statement. No one read it. Irth resigned from the Varan military before the ruling was announced. Her application to the assembly as a technical consultant was processed in 3 days, faster than usual. She suspected someone had pushed it through. She never found out who. On the Deathali moon, blessed Amu gathered the council. Amu was not a person who made long speeches about victory. Amu said the moons were theirs, the record now said so clearly, and they owed something to a crew of strangers who had no reason to stay and stayed anyway. The council voted to name the landing field the Carrion Field. They sent a message to Rudo. Rudo replied that they did not have to do that. Amu replied that the sign was already carved. Rudo showed Petra the exchange. Petra said it was nice. Then she asked when they were leaving because they were 11 days behind schedule. Rudo filed the departure notice, thanked Yaveth's staff, and lifted off the next morning. The carrion Comfort climbed out of the green-gray light of the Oran moon and back into open space. Brick finished the last of the Deathali dried fruit. Anya labeled her soil samples. Wool updated his bookmarks. In the months that followed, 3 other species filed previously suppressed complaints against the Varin collective. 2 involved distress signal manipulation. With the Oran case as clean precedent, inconclusive no longer worked. Petra's triangulation method was distributed to Assembly member states as a standard verification tool. In the technical literature, it was called the carrion method. Petra found this funnier than Rudo did. 6 months later, on a different route, another distress signal came through. Rudo looked at the navigation chart. It was not a short detour. He looked at the crew. Wool was already running the triangulation. Petra was already checking fuel reserves. Anya was already asking about dietary restrictions for whatever species lived in that sector. Rudo changed course. Nobody needed to say anything.